From cake to candy, ice cream to our favorite soft drink, sugar makes us happy. Ever since we figured out how to get this out of this, well, it's been responsible for birthday parties, holiday cheer, and massive amounts of human trafficking. The story of sugar is terrible. It's the worst subject we've ever covered. But when it comes to understanding our modern world, well, nothing has been more important. It gave us our financial systems, created our national borders, and led us across the oceans. Without sugar, there's no Victorian England, no Pirates of the Caribbean, and no Nazi gas chambers, and no donuts or delicious desserts. So go ahead and grab your favorite sweet snack, settle in, and get ready for the most depressing story in the history of food. The story of sugar, today on OTR. Have you ever noticed that when we really like someone, we start to associate them with food? Not any food, like you wouldn't call your girlfriend braised beef even if it's your favorite meal. It has to be dessert. Anything sweet, sugar, cupcake, muffin, sweetheart, honey bun, whatever. Honestly, it's almost reflexive that when something or a person makes us happy, well, we think about sugar. And if that sounds like an exaggeration, well, just turn on the radio and listen out for how many songs are about sweet foods, at least metaphorically. Seriously, it's crazy. And it's not just a modern phenomenon. You can go all the way back to the days of the phonograph, and it's endless. As a matter of fact, we could literally make this the entire video. Just sit here for an hour listing songs about sweets. And we're not just talking about English. Wherever you are, if you turn on some pop music, there's a good chance you'll hear someone singing about candy, sugar, or the favorite local treat. Now, this might feel surprising, but the truth is it makes complete sense. Music is supposed to trigger an emotion, and since the very beginning of childhood, we're taught to associate sugar with the ultimate happiness. We are Pavlov's dog, and sweets are our reward for pretty much everything. Sugar is what gets us through a tough day. It's our prize for birthdays, our bond at weddings, and our solace when our hearts are broken. Dessert is our incentive for eating our veggies, and if we're sick, well, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. That's another song, by the way. And when we look back on our favorite memories of holidays, well, sugar is right there. From Christmas cookies to Easter chocolates to the diabetes fest that is Halloween. And again, this is not limited to the West. It's no different in China at the Mid-Autumn Festival or the Muslim world to celebrate the end of Ramadan. But of course, we don't need to wait for special occasions to eat something sweet. Across our entire planet, if you average out the 8.1 billion people, well, we all consume an average of 20 kilograms per year, 44 pounds of pure white sugar. And while my fellow Americans still lead the way, the whole world is addicted to the stuff. From Western Europe to the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa to right here in Thailand, where locals knock down as much as 40 kilos of sugar annually, and that's not even including palm sugar. We're just talking about the granulated stuff, found in mass-produced snacks and drinks. Today, sugar is the world's most widely cultivated crop. 21% of all the agricultural output of the planet is sugarcane, and 1.9 billion tons are produced each year. And what's crazy is that 1.9 billion tons is more than all of the global output of rice and wheat put together. In other words, we eat more sugar each year than our two most essential staples combined. And we don't even need it. Biologically, we get all the sugar we need from rice and wheat, along with pretty much everything else in a normal and healthy diet. Sugar is completely unique in our world of food in that we eat it because we like it, not because we need it. We have literally rewired our own brains to crave sweets constantly, and how that happened, well, that's our story. So let's get into it and start at the very beginning. Around 10,000 years ago on the South Pacific island of New Guinea, the native people called the Melanesians became one of the world's first tribes to settle down, build permanent houses, and start farming. And to supply their new villages, they would domesticate 3 plants endemic to their home island. There were bananas, taro, and something they'd call the pit, what today we know as sugarcane. Now, unlike bananas and taro, the Melanesians didn't actually eat sugar. Instead, they fed the cane to their domesticated pigs, and that would be the extent of the use of sugarcane for much of ancient history. Now, New Guinea was not the only place where sugarcane grew wild. It's a grass, and in nature there were versions all throughout the Asian tropics. But this was the only varietal cultivated and the only one that animals seemed to like to eat. And the reason was a genetic adaptation seen nowhere else in nature. Essentially, when the plant would go through photosynthesis, it would convert sunlight into two forms of energy, glucose and fructose, and those molecules would combine into sucrose or sugar. Now, that's not the unique part. Every plant makes sugar. That's what photosynthesis is. But usually it's used right away to make fruits or new leaves or to grow taller. In the case of Saccharum officinarum, New Guinea sugarcane, well, the sugar would be stored away inside segments called internodes, and over time it would build up, within a year almost bursting with a sweet liquid. Anyway, around 1500 BC, a second group would arrive on New Guinea, the Austronesians, and they would carry sugarcane with them across the Pacific, where farmers would crossbreed it with local variations, introducing a hybrid version of the plant to Taiwan, the Philippines, Madagascar, and northeast India. And that's where the story of sugar truly begins. It was in what's now Bengal where we first see sugarcane used for human consumption. Not immediately in stuff like desserts, but almost like chewing tobacco. Farmers would snap a stalk open, cut off a bit of wood, and chew on it for the sweet flavor, with the added benefit of a jolt of energy. Then soon enough, the canes were being crushed and the liquid extracted, and sugarcane juice became a favorite refreshment in the hot Indian sun. But the problem was the drink had to be consumed immediately or it would start to go bad. Now, I want you to keep this in mind because this is going to be a massive part of the rest of this story. But basically, the minute you cut down a stalk of sugarcane, enzymes start breaking down the sucrose. It stops being sweet. So you have to extract the juice right away. But then there's a second problem, which is that the liquid begins to ferment. Within as little as 15 minutes, the juice itself is no longer viable, which means even if Bengali farmers wanted to find a way to preserve it, well, by the time the sugarcane was carried from the fields, juiced, and cooked, well, it was probably already too late, and everything would need to be thrown away. Around the year 500 BC, we start to see the first major sugar breakthrough, with entire Bengali villages coming together to harvest sugarcane and boil it right on the spot, right in the middle of the fields. Now, most likely they were just looking to cook the juice so it would last longer, but as it evaporated, it began to thicken, and what was left was a concentrated solid the locals called gur. Today we call it jaggery. Within 100 years of the invention of jaggery, those same farmers would add one more step to the process, spreading out the cooked sugar to cool down and crystallize. This would leave behind fragments referred to as khanda, Sanskrit for small pieces and the root of the modern word candy. And since a pile of khanda looked like a bunch of rocks, well, the locals called it sharkara, meaning gravel. Today we pronounce that word sugar. In the early days of sugar production, the Bengalis treated jaggery as a delicacy. It was made only once a year, after the harvest in November. And since there was only a small amount to go around, this was not used for cooking. It was medicine, a cure for disease. And on the way to the fields, a farmer might eat a small pinch as breakfast, a pick-me-up to start a long and hard day. We might be in luck. Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So what we're buying right now, just to kind of walk you through this as I'm paying, I'm not quite sure what our friendly sales agent here at the store is going to think of me, but I guess it's not uncommon for an American to show up and buy 5 different kinds of sugar. We do have a sweet tooth. Thank you. Dennis, you want to try this? I'm going to hand this to you. So, if you've only ever had kind of pure white refined sugar, it has there's more flavor, there's more to it when it's just pure cane juice boiled down and allowed to harden and not crystallize. This is not crystallized sugar, this is just jaggery. It's very, almost like, as an American, we would know like maple syrupy. I don't know what you'd compare it to. Yeah, it's got a much rounder, fuller, deeper flavor, and you get that immediate pop of energy. So of course, when you didn't know what was causing that, and you didn't know what sugar was, you would find this a miracle cure. All right, we're gonna take that home. Okay, kapun makab. Around 500 BC, just as the Bengalis were unlocking the secrets of making jaggery, Darius the Great of Persia invaded North India and brought back samples of sugarcane to the Middle East. He'd have it planted in a region that would come to be known as Khuzestan, or the Land of Sugar, and from there the Persians would become the first to at least attempt to sell and profit from refined sugar. But it didn't go well. The only known buyers of Persian sugar were the ancient Romans, who used it as medicine, described in writing by Galen as, and I quote, a laxative of medium quality. And Pliny the Elder would reference cane sugar as a treatment for issues with the bladder. It also seems like the Romans bought at least one shipment of the byproduct of Persian crystallization, a dark and sticky substance that shows up in a Roman import record as malaceus, or knockoff honey. Today we pronounce that word as molasses. And that is basically the extent of the global sugar trade for the first 1,000 years after we started making it into a source of food. Now, to be fair, there were a lot of reasons why in the beginning nobody really cared about sugar. For one thing, we didn't need it. We had honey along with other stuff like sticky rice and sweeteners made from grains like barley, all of which were cheap and accessible, and this brings up another problem, which was that sugar was expensive. The process of making sugar was so difficult and quantities were so small that the Indians didn't even try to sell it, and the Persians wouldn't accept barters. It had to be bought with gold. Nothing else was valuable enough to trade for the sweet crystals. But nobody saw the value in spending that kind of money on a, quote, laxative of medium quality. By the height of the early Silk Road, sugar basically disappears from recorded history, and it might have been forgotten completely if it wasn't for a series of events that were just about to be set in motion, far away to the east, in the royal palace of Tang Dynasty, China. It's the middle of the 7th century, and Emperor Taizong is nearing the end of a reign so glorious that every subsequent Chinese monarch would be required to study his life and lessons. Taizong would establish his family dynasty as a power, consolidate control over the kingdom, and most of all, bring Buddhism into the Chinese mainstream, which led to widespread cultural exchanges with India. Chinese monks would make pilgrimages to the subcontinent to learn Sanskrit and translate sacred books, and one of those monks was a man named Xuanzang, who in 645 returned from Nalanda in the middle of the Bengali sugar fields and told Emperor Taizong about a plant he'd encountered, one that was sweet to the taste and revered by local Indians. Taizong was so intrigued he sent a delegation across the mountains, who would return 2 years later with samples and farming knowledge. Now, it would take some time before sugar would succeed in China, but eventually in Guangdong and Fujian the plant would start to grow, and the local workers, well, they would take the production process very seriously. Within the first 200 years after the plant's arrival, Chinese sugar growers had introduced countless advancements in refinement. They started boiling the stalks before crushing to break down cell structure. They added alkaline clay during reduction and strained the mixture through cloth sieves, and the end result was by the 10th century AD, they were making something that didn't look like chunks of gravel, but instead was pretty shockingly close to what we know today. Chinese sugar would enter the Silk Road markets at the same high price as the stuff sold by the Persians. But this time, well, to buyers with enough gold, it was worth the investment. Instead of a mediocre laxative, sugar was now a status symbol, made into statues displayed by the rich and powerful, and in China, well, a new export industry would take shape. To handle the sale and distribution of this new premium product, a trading pier was built in the middle of the sugar fields along the Fujian coast, in a place called Quanzhou near the end of the 11th century. Over time, the port at Quanzhou would start to handle a lot more than sugar. Jade, precious gems, and silks all found their way through the harbor, and within a few decades, 500,000 people called the area home. When Marco Polo arrived in 1292, he would describe Quanzhou as the Alexandria of the East, and Ibn Battuta 50 years later would write that it was simply the best port in the world. And while by then Quanzhou was a center of global commerce, well, sugar was still front and center. Vendors along the docks making sculptures out of melted sugar to sell to kids, and everyone who stopped by had to try the port's specialty, a snack called Bakkwa, made of pork marinated in sugar and soy sauce, and then dried over a charcoal fire. Quite possibly, the world's first sugary street food.
เป็นตั้งแต่รุ่นพ่อนะคะรุ่นพ่อค่ะเปิดมาก็ตั้งแต่สมัยพ่อก็น่าจะ60-70 ปีแล้วค่ะ
ครอบครัวเรามาจากจีน
อากงอาม่ามาจากเมืองจีนแต่ว่าพ่อแม่ก็คือเกิดที่ไทยเนี่ยค่ะเกิดที่ไทย
It might be a mystery exactly how long Heeing Pork Shop has been open, but what isn't a question is that for generations of Bangkok's Hokkien diaspora, well, this place has been making some of the city's best Bakkwa, along with other southern Chinese pork delicacies.
อันนี้มันเป็นหมูหยองอันนี้มันเป็นหมูสวรรค์มันจะใส่เครื่องเทศมีเครื่องเทศอันนี้จะเป็นหมูฝอยจะเป็นหอมเจียวก็คือทุกอย่างอ่ะพวกนี้จะเป็นเนื้อหมูหมดเลยอะค่ะแต่เพียงอันนี้มันจะใส่เป็นหอมเจียวอันนี้หมูมันก็เขาจะไปต้มแล้วก็ไปฉีกแล้วก็หมักด้วยน้ำตาลกับน้ำปลาเหมือนกันนะคะ
As far as their Bakkwa goes, the recipe is simple. Slices of pork marinated in sugar, soy sauce, and fish sauce. Then, of course, it's grilled over charcoal. All of the specialties here are ancient. They're all essential to Hokkien identity, and they all use sugar.
Okay, so before we get any further, let me just quickly tell you like what you're seeing. You know, this is a shop that's near Klong Toi Market, where we started today, and they make their own pork products. So Chinese sausage. That's why I know this shop. I pick some up and bring it home because I think this is one of the best in the whole city, and I've got some that I'm going to be taking home, not related to this video, but they also make other old school Southern Chinese pork snacks, and what we're here for is this, which is just sweet pork. It's kind of candied and glazed. You know, this in the old days, you got to think about kind of what sugar was. When we had honey as a sweetener, and so sugar was, you know, there were such small quantities of it, and I've got my bag of sugar from the market over there, but like, you know, it was such a valuable thing that we didn't necessarily immediately know what we were going to. I mean, it's medicine first. What are we going to do with it? And in China, it was a seasoning. It was sweet salt, is what people used to call it. And so sweet salt is just a kind of seasoning, and people started using it first for meat. So we see sugar in some old fish recipes, and mostly associated with pork. This is what you would have found sold along the docks at Quanzhou. Oh, it was so much better than I thought it was going to be. It almost tastes like pemmican, you know? Like, it has that pepperiness. Like beef jerky. The sweetness is not overwhelming. This isn't like candy pork. This is going to be a little bit more like candied pork, these little shreds of it. But, yeah. Wow.
In ancient Persian mythology, the world was once the site of a long battle between good and evil. The good side was represented by a mythical dynasty called the Pishtadians, and the fourth Pishtadian king, known as Jamshid, well, he would be the one to finally expel the darkness and, in the process, create human civilization. This is the origin story of a religion we call Zoroastrianism, and the anniversary of Jamshid's great victory would become the Persian New Year, or Nowruz. Now, according to the legend, on the first day of the very first Nowruz celebration, Jamshid himself was riding his horse through a valley when he saw something auspicious, a tall plant dripping with a sweet and entrancing liquid. He would cut down the stalk and boil the juice into crystals, and thus the Persians would receive the gift of sugar, a present from the gods to symbolize the triumph of the light. The story of Jamshid and the sacred sugar would become popular during the years of the Sasanian Empire, around the 3rd century AD, and that was when we see a tradition begin of honoring the triumph of good versus evil, by making sweets with sugar every New Year holiday, the world's first example of dessert made from sugar. And then the Sasanians would fall, Persia would be invaded, and those desserts were about to become a sensation, which brings us to the next part of this story. It's the middle of the 7th century AD, exactly the same time as the first sugarcane was being delivered to Tang Dynasty China. The Persian Empire has been defeated by an upstart army charging east from Saudi Arabia, the Rashidun Caliphate, led by Abu Bakr, whose son-in-law Muhammad had just established a new Islamic faith. Within 100 years, the Arabs would control a territory stretching from Spain to Central Asia, and wherever they conquered, they'd bring sugarcane and the Persian technique of making sweets. Now, the process of sugar cultivation was still incredibly difficult, and this was not a product meant for the masses. It would be exclusive to sultans and the most esteemed clerics and rulers. But within the highest Muslim classes, sugar was beloved. An 8th century poem records the idea that a proper royal meal should start with something savory and then finish with a taste of sweetness, the first reference ever to the concept of dessert. And as for what that dessert could be, well, there were breads coated in confectioner's sugar, an Arabic invention. There was a thick beverage meant as just a tiny sip and made by combining sugar with water, called sharab, or syrup. And for real luxury, you'd combine syrup with rose water, and this would become julab, today pronounced as julep, as in the official drink of the Kentucky Derby. This is also the root of India's gulab jamun, as Persian desserts popularized by the Arabs would much later catch on in Mughal India, bringing the entire story full circle. But that's not the point. Here's what matters. To get all this sugar, the Arabs started buying from the Chinese. And by the 13th century, Persian Muslim businessmen had taken over control of the famous port of Quanzhou. And if the story of sugar so far seems pretty undramatic, well, this would be the point when it all starts to go crazy. The trigger for 1,000 years of madness. Now, try to follow me because I'm going to run through a whole bunch of wild stuff in a very short amount of time, but basically it goes like this. The Chinese Yuan dynasty did not like the idea of foreign Muslims taking control of a major financial hub. So starting in 1357, China passed a few laws restricting Persian ownership rights. This would trigger an uprising around the port called the Ispa Rebellion, which would last for 9 years and end with the Chinese massacring every foreigner in the city of Quanzhou. The Muslims who managed to escape would flee south and reorganize on the island of Java, where among other things they would bring Islam. As a matter of fact, the first Indonesian sultan ever was descended from those refugees. In China, the Yuan would be so weakened by the long conflict that 2 years after the massacre, they were overthrown, replaced by the Ming, who decided the best way to escape the Yuan's fate was to close China to the outside world, completely. So in 1371, China shut down the sugar trade, and this meant that hundreds of thousands of Hokkien farmers and processors suddenly had no way to make a living, so they would leave for Southeast Asia. Their new communities would eventually include Malacca, Singapore, Penang, and Phuket, their descendants known as the Peranakan. Now, because the Arabs lost their connection to Chinese sugar, well, they'd start investing in their own plantations, building refineries in today's Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria, and in time they would have enough to service the sultans of the Arab kingdoms. But demand for sugar was spreading beyond the Middle East. Thanks to the conquests of a Muslim group known as the Moors, well, Islam, and by extension sugar, found its way into Spain and Portugal, and by the time of the Ming Dynasty ban, well, the product was working its way through European high society. Now, since sugar only grows in hot climates, Europe would have to import its sugar from abroad. They traded gold to the Arabs for sweets, candy, and vials of syrup. From India, buyers would ship in refined crystals along with molasses, and to get a piece of the action, the Venetians who ran the local spice trade, well, they'd set up small refineries on the islands of Cyprus and Crete. And that's how the sugar economy would work. Until all of a sudden, everything fell apart. The Crusades meant that the Arabs stopped trading with Europe. The Ottomans shut down the Silk Road, which cut off India from Western markets, and just like that, the only sugar available was that tiny bit from the Venetians, who immediately jacked up the price so high that 1 gram of sugar around the year 1450 was now the most expensive product ever recorded in human history. Sugar was now more valuable than gold, and the rest of Europe wanted in on the action. But since it wouldn't grow at home and the East was now off limits, well, they would need to start exploring.
So good. Take it from the sugar side, from the butter side. It's delicious, no?
I know in chronological order this is not when we'd take a break for a donut. I mean, that concept doesn't show up until the 19th century, and the stuff served here, well, this is, we'll call it a modern twist on the concept. But since this is a video about sugar, we just figured we'd enjoy one sweet snack before this story gets f***ing terrible. In a way, the idea that sugar would be the most expensive of all the old world spices seems unlikely. I mean, compared to stuff like nutmeg and saffron, sugarcane was everywhere, all across the Asian tropics. But the issue with sugar wasn't just supply, it was also production. Every single step, from hacking down the 5-meter-tall reeds, cutting off the razor-sharp leaves and crushing it with a heavy stone roller, to boiling and filtering and reboiling and refiltering, well, all of it had to be done by hand, in hot and humid weather and with no breaks, because if it wasn't done fast, well, everything would go to waste. Farming and refining sugar was a dangerous and backbreaking job, and since the beginning, well, the only way to do it was to force people against their will. The first example of slaves working sugar fields goes all the way back to ancient Bengal, where the farmers who grew sugarcane for Jaggery put in a system where the lower caste needed to fill their quotas, or they'd get thrown off the land. The Persians and later the Arabs of the Middle East staffed their sugar operations with prisoners of war, debtors arrested for owing money, and religious captives, and the Venetian sugar farms on Cyprus and Crete, well, they relied on workers taken in raids of Eastern Europe, today's Croatia, Georgia, and Armenia. These would also be the regions where the Turks would find their own sugar processors, and the word slave, well, it just comes from Slav, as in the Slavic people. It's not an exaggeration to say that without forced labor, refined sugar could never have existed. Ever. But at least we're talking about a luxury product at an extremely small scale. The conditions were awful, but sugar was basically just meant as a showpiece for the richest kings and noblemen. It would be crazy to imagine scaling it up and thinking about mass production. I mean, that would need an almost endless supply of land and more humans to work this brutal job than... Oh, all right, I have a feeling that this is not going to go in a good direction. In the early 15th century, the Portuguese came up with a plan to break the Venetian sugar monopoly. Off the coast in the Atlantic, they discovered 2 uninhabited islands, so they decided to turn them both into self-contained factories, growing, processing, and exporting sugar. The first they'd call São Miguel, 760 square kilometers of lush terrain so abundant that today it's nicknamed the Green Island in the middle of the Azores. By the 1430s, waves of noblemen had arrived bringing prisoners to do the labor, but after a few failed harvests, it was clear that the climate was just a little bit too cold, so instead focus would turn to the south, to the island of Madeira. Now there, southwest of Portugal and 500 kilometers off the coast of Morocco, sugarcane would thrive, and all across Europe this was cause for relief and celebration. With a steady supply of sugar, the Portuguese could finally undercut Venetian prices, and soon enough, a new economy would take shape, with importers and distributors from Antwerp to London taking a cut of the profits. And to keep the good times rolling, well, they'd promote sugar to the general public for the very first time, and we see the beginning of the sweets and desserts that we all know today. Anyway, with more demand came the need to increase production, but the Portuguese had run out of prisoners to do the actual work. So they started raiding the African mainland, capturing a few dozen Moroccan Berbers, then a few dozen more, then thousands. The African slaves were made to dig canals to increase the size of the plantations. Before long, there were 2,100 kilometers of waterways that would turn Madeira into a sugar-growing machine. But with thousands of pots now boiling 24 hours a day, well, that required a lot of lumber. And one day, there were no more trees to cut down. Just a few decades after arriving on the island, it was ruined, and Madeira, for all intents and purposes, had been used up. Now, in recent years, as we take stock of everything that's gone wrong with our treatment of the planet, a lot of economists point to Madeira as the place where society changed. Before this colony, people would move around based on normal human factors, safety, access to food, and stuff like that. Then whatever they'd find or cultivate is what they would trade to make money. But starting with Madeira, the calculation would flip. Now people were moving to follow commodities, thinking about money first, and then working out how to survive. And that had never happened before. Now, when it comes to Madeira, from a purely financial perspective, it was a massive success. And the people who'd made the profits, well, they were ready to try again. This included Bartolomeu Perestrello, the leader of the Madeira colony, and of course his son-in-law and right-hand man, a Genoese sugar trader by the name of Christopher Columbus. All right, now before we start this segment, I need to make one thing clear. What happened in the sugar trade during the Age of Exploration has been the subject of a ton of incredible books and comprehensive studies. Anthropologists and historians have devoted entire careers to exploring this topic, and there is no way we can tell this story here in any kind of complete way. So just keep in mind that for this next part, all we're going to be doing is going through the headlines, and the whole massive story is just so much worse than what we have time to cover. But here are the broad strokes. After Christopher Columbus accidentally bumped into the West Indies, he would come back the next year in 1493 with stalks of sugar. But it would take him another decade to find what he considered the perfect place to be his new Madeira, the island we now call Jamaica. Plans were made for a large-scale refinery, but then Columbus died and his son Diego was put in charge, and to clear the land, a few thousand indigenous Taino were marched at gunpoint to the new settlement. But this was not well thought out. The land wasn't well suited for planting, and as for the Taino, well, they had a bad habit of dying, either from overwork, Spanish diseases, or a lack of food, since the colonists also didn't take feeding the slaves into account. Anyway, where the Spanish failed, the Portuguese would succeed a few decades later and further to the south. In what's now northeast Brazil by the year 1534, we see the seeds of new enterprises, with wealthy investors bringing experts from Madeira to design entire production cities. Along with sugar farms and refineries, the Portuguese constructed foundries to make cast iron kettles, stone masonries to build furnaces, carpenter shops and cooper buildings, and basically these were complete sugar colonies, which would be a template repeated over and over. And with all these new buildings, well, the Portuguese would need people. And by now there weren't a lot of natives left. So in 1542, a Portuguese planter asked the crown for permission to begin importing slaves from Africa. And the answer, of course, was yes. This would begin what would come to be called the Triangle Trade: sugar from the Americas, money from Europe, and humans from Africa. And on the cycle would grow. On the European side, demand for sugar was skyrocketing. Shops began selling cakes and pastries, candy was suddenly accessible to the masses, and products like tea, coffee, and chocolate, disregarded in the past for tasting too bitter, well, suddenly, with just a little bit of sugar, they were all new sensations. In the New World, while the Portuguese had a sugar monopoly, but only for a short time, as the Dutch quickly built their own farms in South America. Then the Dutch and Portuguese would go to war, and with the sugar supply interrupted, onto the scene came the French, the Spanish, and the English, all looking to build their own sugar empires. And with each new plantation came more African slaves. Hell, by the 1600s, all the labor had to be imported because there were no more natives. Every last Taino, dead from disease, starvation, or massacre, or from work related to the sugar fields. The New World sugar plantations were brutal. Working conditions were shocking, the heat was oppressive, and the average life expectancy for any slave assigned to the industry was 8 years. That's it, 8 years. And with so much turnover, well, even more slaves would have to be sent across the Atlantic, and the numbers would be staggering. 250,000 to French Martinique, and 3 times that number to Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti. 1 million Africans to the British colony of Jamaica, and 400,000 more to Barbados. The Spanish would import 800,000 to work the fields of Cuba. The Dutch would send 500,000 to Suriname, and 600,000 to Curacao, although that wasn't a sugar field. It was a slave market, auctioning off humans to plantation owners from across the South Atlantic. And as for the Portuguese, well, with full control of Brazil, they'd bring in 5.5 million Africans, completely repopulating the world's 5th largest country, with slaves trafficked from across the ocean. Altogether, during the years of the transatlantic slave trade, 12.5 million people were sent by force to the Americas. Honestly, a lot more when you consider that anyone who didn't survive the ocean crossing wasn't even counted in the numbers. And of this unbelievable total, 70%, 7 out of every 10 slaves, were sent to the New World to work in the sugar industry. And since there's no reasonable segue from this kind of subject, well, let's just take a break and go get drunk. In the mid-1500s, pretty much as soon as the first sugar colonies show up in Brazil, the slaves began turning some of the liquid into alcohol, in the beginning fermenting the foam that the Portuguese would skim off and throw away during crystallization. The name for this waste product was cachaço. Today, cachaça is still the national drink of Brazil. Then 100 years later in Barbados, a contract was signed for a warehouse meant to store something called rum bouillon, described in writing as a hot, hellish, and terrible liquor, and this was how the world would be introduced to rum. Yeah, so this is, what are we drinking? We're drinking Captain Morgan's dark rum. Interesting thing about rum, there is no difference in the rum making process, whether it's light rum, dark rum, spiced rum. It's just clear spirit. You distill it from molasses and it's clear. The color is from aging in barrels. I don't have a microphone on you. Cheers. When rum was first introduced, it would quickly become a part of the daily rations of British sailors. Not because they loved the stuff, but because it was said that adding alcohol to water could stave off scurvy. Before long, pretty much all of the boats sailing back and forth across the Atlantic were including rum in their provisions, the English earning the nickname limeys for adding a squeeze of citrus to their watered-down rum. Pretty much everyone was finding ways to make their rum more appealing, and it was on the boats of the Caribbean where the idea of the cocktail first shows up. According to beverage historians, the first cocktail ever was something called the bumbo, made from rum, water, and sugar mixed with nutmeg and cinnamon. It would become a sensation that influenced our mainstream culture, but this was not invented by the British Royal Navy or any official merchant mariners. It was the drink of another group of people who loved their rum, and who made a living by taking their own cut of the sugar trade. In the early 1600s, a group of French farmers on Hispaniola had abandoned their attempt at a sugar plantation and were living off the land, raising pigs and cattle. They built huts for smoking meat, given the Taino word boucan. In French, they'd call themselves boucaniers, or buccaneers. Now, they would have been content to stay farmers forever, but then the Spanish arrived and attacked, so the buccaneers took refuge on a small island off the northern coast, a place called Tortuga, and from there they'd take their revenge. Now, at first, the Frenchmen were only interested in making life miserable for the Spanish, but soon their exploits would earn the attention of others who sought to cause trouble for their enemies, and back then, well, everyone had enemies. So the demand for piracy soared, and more people, out-of-work farmers, runaway slaves, and even noblemen, made their way to Tortuga, and thus began the golden age of piracy. Now, back then, the Europeans used to protect their colonies by contracting ships called privateers to keep other people away. The privateers would be paid in bounty. Whenever they raided another boat, they were allowed to keep a share of the rum and gold, the rest the property of the crown. But buccaneers acknowledged no king, so by 1650, nearly all privateers were now ignoring orders and flying their own pirate flag. And with so much of the world's economy sailing in and out of their territory, well, the spoils were incredible. Sir Francis Drake was a privateer turned pirate who made so much money, he'd become a famous explorer and earn a British knighthood. Though in Spain, he's still known by the nickname the Dragon. And then there was Henry Morgan, originally from Wales. When he decided to strike out on his own, he recruited a crew from Tortuga and would steal so much gold he'd end up buying out Jamaica's sugar industry, becoming one of the richest men alive and a major celebrity in the UK, the dreaded Captain Morgan. Now, the glory days of piracy would end as quickly as they'd begin, with the European countries finally agreeing in 1713 to stop fighting each other, turning their navies instead against the pirates of the Caribbean. But by that time, they were anti-heroes, legends described in songs and stories, and there could be no better marketing for rum. Even today, it's impossible to think of one without the other. In 1624, Dutch ships arrived in the western Pacific at a place once named Formosa by Portuguese explorers, the Island of Beauty. Since the Dutch were about to lose all their Brazilian holdings, this was their backup plan. And as soon as they landed, they started work on what would be the most ambitious sugar plantation ever conceived. Now, when the Dutch arrived, Formosa wasn't empty, but it was pretty close. The total population was somewhere around 50,000, divided into small tribes of Austronesians, the very same people whose ancestors once sailed to New Guinea and started this whole story. But the Dutch didn't care about the locals, and they weren't bringing African slaves either. No, their idea was to pay a visit to Fujian, around the old Quanzhou port, and recruit as many disaffected Chinese as possible, to try to convince the world's most venerated sugar masters to leave behind the isolationist Ming and come work for Holland. And this would be the birth of what we now call Taiwan. Now, the Taiwanese sugar colony would prove an incredible success. An estimated 35,000 Fujianese made the move to the island, and for the Dutch, well, their new Pacific supply of sugar would help them not just keep their European market share, but got them exclusive trading access to Japan, after the shogun kicked everyone else out in 1639. After 40 years, the Dutch would lose control of Taiwan, and the island would gain a brief period of independence, but because of sugar, it wouldn't last for long. See, there was a saying that was popular throughout mainland China, and what it meant was essentially that one could not walk in Taiwan because there was just so much money lying around everywhere. So, of course, the Chinese government sent in a massive force and subjugated Taiwan as a province, and then right away brought in even more sugar farmers. The island's population would swell to more than 2 million, and by 1750, Taiwan was the world's leading exporter of sugar, producing 6 times as much refined product as the entire colony of Brazil. As tragic as the transatlantic slave trade was, maybe the most shocking part of the whole thing was that in the end it wasn't even necessary for Europe's sugar supply. By the middle of the 18th century, there were enormous plantations owned by or selling to the West, not just in Taiwan, but across Southeast Asia, with equipment made in China and workers migrating from Fujian. There were massive enterprises on Luzon in the Philippines, the Indonesian island of Java, in Vietnam's Mekong Delta, and even here in Siam, where by the 1800s, 12,000 tons a year were being sold into Europe, and we're not even talking about the grandfather of sugar. But India was very much still there, and about to make its mark on our story one more time. In 1781, a British slave ship called the Zong was sailing across the Atlantic when the captain realized he'd miscalculated provisions and there wasn't enough drinking water to complete the trip. So he had his men execute all 130 Africans on board, then filed an insurance claim when they arrived in Jamaica. Now, under any other circumstances, this would not have made the news, but someone at the insurance company tipped off a freed slave and abolitionist named Olade Equiano, who then paid a visit to Granville Sharp, an allied lawyer, and from there, well, this was just the kind of sensation that they knew might start an anti-slavery movement, and that's exactly what happened. The Quakers came on board almost immediately. Then the industrialist Josiah Wedgwood, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who went as far as to design a logo. Poets and writers made sure the newspaper stayed engaged, and the public couldn't get enough of the sordid details. And then finally in 1791, 500,000 British citizens went on strike against New World Sugar, the first commercial boycott ever in history. And it would prove effective. Nearly overnight, all major shops and vendors switched to carrying, quote, ethical sugar from British India. Signs outside bakeries and candy stores advertised sugar from the East Indies, not the West Indies, and shipments sent from India started carrying the slogan, free grown, or made by free people. The details of the Zong massacre and the book that Equiano would publish would finally turn public sentiment against slavery across the continent. And just 1 year after the sugar boycott, Denmark would become the first European country to ban the transatlantic slave trade, and from there, well, the ball would slowly start rolling. Now, the legacy of the free-grown sugar movement is complicated. On one hand, the public pressure to outlaw slavery was huge, and it would be a major turning point. But by focusing only on the slave trade, the public ignored the environmental catastrophe that was unfolding, not just in the New World, but in Taiwan, Indonesia, and beyond, where entire jungles were being cut down to keep up with demand. There was no discussion about the brutal nature of sugarcane work in the first place, paid or unpaid, as even where there was no slavery, sugar plantations still had the highest mortality of any industry. As a matter of fact, with quotas increasing by the 1800s, the average life expectancy on a sugar field had actually gone down from 8 to 7 years, slave or otherwise. And of course, there was the fact that sugar from India wasn't exactly a utopian product itself. The workers on English colonial plantations in a lot of cases didn't have any more choice than African slaves. Their hours were just as brutal, payment was next to nothing, and the sugar was hardly the conscientious product that consumers seemed to believe. But maybe we just didn't want to know, since the one thing never discussed at all was just giving up sugar, even though it had only been a part of our diet for 200 years. By this point, we were hooked, and there was no going back. One last note, by the way, in 1838, when England would finally abolish slavery in the colonies, the new Queen Victoria would agree to a system of compensation to make up for the change in policy. The Crown agreed to pay a sum to anyone invested in the sugar trade to help smooth over the loss of free human labor, and the payouts were so high that it would bring about what we now call the Victorian era. It would be the largest stimulus in history relative to the size of an economy, and it would kickstart the Industrial Revolution and bring about a new British Golden Age. As for the slaves themselves, well, they got nothing. Let's take another rum break. You know, it's funny because we're sitting here at a cocktail bar, and like, what is a cocktail, right? You know, this was my job forever. I was behind a bar, you know, making cocktails, and a cocktail is something strong like a liquor, something sour or bitter, and then something sweet to bring it into balance. And, you know, that sweetness, you know, I can't imagine, like, what is the base cocktail? The base cocktail is a daiquiri. It's rum, it's lime or citrus, and it's sugar. You know, what's an old fashioned? What's a Manhattan? You go through these cocktails, there's always that sweet element that has to balance out the rest of it. And like, it's the same thing when we talk about what are the basic flavor profiles of food.
sweet, sour, spicy, salty, bitter, umami, right? Like, that sweetness is new. This is not something that's always existed. You know, we were just, the last video we made before this, we were taping in Lake Toba in Indonesia, and that's a place where the cuisine is 3,000 years old. You know, Dennis, you remember we were just down there, there was no sugar. They don't use it. It does not exist in their cuisine. And like, it's interesting when you think about our basic idea of what something tastes like, a drink or food. It incorporates this flavor, which is brand new, which we didn't have, you know, we couldn't afford, we didn't know about it, and we had fruits, we had honey, but we weren't, a meal was not something that had to involve, you know, a sweet element. This is something that kind of, you know, it's only been a few generations like this, but we can't even imagine what food or drinks would be like without it. Take sugar out of cocktails and there are no more cocktails. It's just not a thing that exists. And that's the end of the bottle, and that means that it's time for us to wrap up here.
A decade after the British sugar boycott, the European continent would be almost completely cut off from New World sugar. Not by choice, but because of a series of blockades thanks to the Napoleonic Wars. So in 1811, Napoleon himself was visited by a delegation of French scientists who told the emperor about a new innovation, one that might enable him to supply his country with sugar made at home with no need to import anything. The basic concept involved the use of a plant that had been found to store sucrose after photosynthesis, just like the sugarcane stalk. It was called the Beta vulgaris, basically the common beet. And while in nature its sugar content was barely 1%, well, for more than half a century, experiments in Germany had quietly managed to increase this to 5%, then 10, then 20, exactly on par with the sugarcane. The idea to cultivate sugar beets came from Frederick the Great, who as a northern king surrounded by enemies was obsessed with food independence. It's also why he's known as the father of potato farming. Anyway, to run the experiments, he'd hire Andreas Marggraf, a Berlin professor of physics, who would successfully crystallize white sugar from beets. And then Marggraf's student Franz Karl Achard would perfect the process and open the first small-scale factory in Poland, which was all the proof that Napoleon needed to see. He'd go all in, ordering 70,000 acres to be planted with sugar beets, and not only did France suddenly find itself with a domestic source of sugar, well, the world had a humane alternative, at least relatively speaking. After all, processing beets didn't involve tropical heat, razor-sharp leaves, or the threat of imminent spoilage. They were just beets. Boil them, and there you go. By 1840, 5% of the world's sugar market had moved from cane to beets, and within 4 more decades, that number was up to half, 50%. And that changed the balance of power, as now it was the beet producers who got to set global prices, and they did through collusion and stock manipulation. As a matter of fact, in the 20th century, the oil cartels would base their structure and models on the tactics of big sugar. And these conglomerates, well, pretty soon they were in the food business as well. Sweet cookies and desserts, breakfast cereals and sodas, and in just 50 years, the average sugar consumption in the United States alone went from 8 kilos per person in 1850 to 41 in 1900. And most of that increase was based on children, who would spend their allowance at the neighborhood candy store. And then, as ad agencies started shaping consumer tastes, well, sugar gives us another breakthrough. Brands like Tootsie Rolls becoming the first products marketed directly to kids. And as if that wasn't enough, there would be one more use for beet sugar that would make an impact on the 20th century. And since this story is already f***ing terrible, well, why not bring in Adolf Hitler just for good measure? See, the Nazis were massive sugar beet producers, in part because they'd been cut off from foreign imports, but also because Hitler himself was so addicted to sweets. He was said to eat 2 pounds of candy every day. He added heaping spoons of sugar to his tea and his wine and his water, and when he died, well, his teeth had already started falling out because of all the sweets. But his main interest in sugar was the fact that a byproduct of crystallizing beets is something known as prussic acid, or as it's more commonly referred to, hydrogen cyanide. The cyanide made by the Nazis from beet sugar wastewater would be given the name Zyklon B, and it was this gas that would be used at concentration camps. And I'm just going to grab a bottle of rum one more time. Just give me a second. In 1954, members of a lobbying group called the SRF, or Sugar Research Foundation, were concerned about press coverage blaming sugar for a surge in obesity, heart disease, and cancer. So they came up with a plan to pay off dozens of scientists, including Harvard professors, to start planting articles in medical journals blaming all the bad stuff on fat, not sugar. Suddenly, our grocery stores were full of low-fat products and fat-free whatever, and all it meant was more and more sugar packed into our food. And our consumption would rise by another 30% in the aftermath of the SRF studies. And the more sugar we eat, the more we destroy not just our health, but our planet. As by now, out of all the land we have, 8% of every square centimeter of land on Earth, it's used to farm sugarcane. Another 2% for sugar beets, and it gets even worse. With monoculture farming comes the risk of pests and disease. So that means more use of pesticides, and that means we need to modify the food itself so it can handle getting sprayed with all those chemicals. And if that sounds over the top, 95% of all the sugar beets grown in the US today are from a species called Roundup Ready, genetically engineered by Monsanto to be resistant to the cancer-causing pesticide Roundup, which is also owned by Monsanto. And if that's not evil enough, in 2018, Monsanto was sold to Bayer, a healthcare company. So now the same conglomerate that tells you what's safe to eat is making your food, making the pesticides in your food, and making the medicine you're gonna need when your food starts to kill you. And I'm not picking on Bayer. That's everything. Pretty much every major food product is now a part of this cycle designed to keep you eating sugar. And we could keep going about all the health crises and environmental crises we're all facing because of our sugar addiction. We could talk about all the human trafficking that's still going on in the false advertising of the, quote, fake sugar industry. But it has been a long day, so I'm just gonna pour myself one more shot, maybe put on some happy music, grab a snack to feel better, anything to wrap up the worst story in the history of food, the story of sugar. Subscribe to the channel for more from OTR. Thank you so much to everyone who supports us on Patreon. It really helps to keep us going. Find links below to our Patreon and social media, and we'll see you soon.